Picture yourself as a 17-year-old girl in Tenochtitlan in the year 1490, and today is the most important day of your life. You've just been chosen as the earthly bride of Xilonen, the maize goddess, an honor that your family celebrates with tears of joy. For the next year, you'll live in luxury beyond imagination, pampered like royalty, fed the finest foods, and worshipped by common people who bow when you pass. You have no idea that in exactly 365 days, you'll be sacrificed on a blood-soaked altar, while priests perform rituals too disturbing for Spanish chroniclers to fully record. Your name is Itzel, and you're about to discover what it really means to serve the Aztec gods. The priests who selected you smile as they explain your divine destiny, but their eyes hold secrets that make your stomach twist with unnamed dread. They describe ceremonies you don't understand, preparations that seem more like violations than honors, and a final wedding night that will unite your body with divinity in ways that no living person should experience. What you're about to live through represents just 1 year in a system of ritualized sexual terror that operated for centuries in the heart of the Aztec Empire. These weren't just religious ceremonies, but carefully designed programs of psychological and physical conditioning that transformed human beings into willing participants in their own destruction. You think you know about Aztec culture from museums and documentaries. The noble warriors, the impressive pyramids, the sophisticated agriculture. Here's what they don't tell you about the civilization that Spanish conquistadors found so shocking they struggled to find words for what they witnessed. Behind the architectural marvels and mathematical achievements was a society that had systematized sexual violence as a religious duty, turning human suffering into divine entertainment. The stone temples that still stand in Mexico City were built on foundations of systematic abuse that makes modern trafficking operations look primitive by comparison. For over 2 centuries, the Aztec Empire operated the most sophisticated system of ritualized intimate terror in human history, where children were groomed for sacrifice, young women were trained as divine concubines, and entire festivals dissolved into religiously sanctioned chaos. One particular ritual they're about to perform on Itzel was so horrific that even Spanish conquistadors who had witnessed the Inquisition's worst tortures would refuse to describe it in their official reports. The most disturbing part? She was taught to crave every moment of it. Between 1300 and 1520 CE, the Aztec Empire created a religious system that turned sexual violence into sacred duty, transforming what we would recognize as systematic abuse into divinely mandated social obligation. This wasn't the work of individual sadists, but a sophisticated theological framework that involved entire communities in the systematic degradation of human beings for the supposed benefit of cosmic order. Recent archaeological excavations at the Templo Mayor in Mexico City have uncovered evidence that confirms the most disturbing accounts left by Spanish chroniclers. Bernardino de Sahagún and Diego Durán, Franciscan monks who interviewed Aztec survivors, documented practices so shocking that their superiors initially refused to believe their reports. These weren't exaggerated propaganda meant to justify conquest, but careful ethnographic studies conducted by men trying to understand the civilization they'd helped destroy. The numbers alone reveal the systematic nature of Aztec intimate practices. Conservative estimates based on tribute records suggest that over 50,000 people annually were processed through various forms of ritualized abuse across the empire. The capital city of Tenochtitlan, with its population of 200,000, operated as the center of this system, drawing victims from across Mesoamerica through tribute demands and military conquest. What made Aztec practices particularly effective was their integration with religious belief, legal systems, and economic structures. The Aztec legal code, documented in tribute lists and court records, created strict hierarchies of who could be intimate with whom under what circumstances. Violations of these hierarchies weren't just crimes, but cosmic offenses that threatened the stability of the universe itself. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tlatlauco and Texcoco shows specialized buildings designed for different types of ritualized sexual activity. These weren't hidden structures, but prominent features of religious complexes, indicating that such practices were celebrated rather than concealed. Bone analysis from these sites reveals patterns of systematic trauma that can only be explained by institutionalized abuse operating for generations. The religious justification was comprehensive and sophisticated. Aztec theology taught that the gods had sacrificed themselves to create the world and required ongoing payments of human suffering to maintain cosmic balance. But this wasn't just about death. It was about specific types of suffering that involved the most intimate aspects of human experience. The gods demanded not just blood, but degradation, not just death, but the systematic destruction of human dignity. Spanish chroniclers struggled to describe what they witnessed because European languages lacked vocabulary for practices that combined religious devotion with systematic abuse. Hernán Cortés wrote letters to the Spanish crown describing ceremonies that he claimed exceeded anything recorded in classical accounts of Roman depravity. These weren't wild accusations meant to justify conquest, but careful observations by men trying to explain an alien moral universe to European readers. The economic dimensions were equally disturbing. Aztec tribute records, written in pictographic script that survived Spanish book burning, show that slaves were among the most valuable commodities in Mesoamerican trade networks. Different regions specialized in providing victims with specific characteristics, creating supply chains that fed the capital's appetite for ritualized suffering. Contemporary Aztec poetry, preserved in works like the Cantares Mexicanos, contains coded references to sexual practices that modern scholars are only beginning to understand. These weren't crude descriptions, but sophisticated literary works that celebrated the transformation of human suffering into divine pleasure. The artistic achievement of these poems makes their content even more disturbing, revealing a culture that had aestheticized systematic abuse. The social psychology of Aztec communities shows classic patterns of societies built on systematic sexual violence, high rates of domestic abuse, casual cruelty toward social inferiors, and an inability to form stable relationships with neighboring peoples, all stemmed from cultural foundations that celebrated suffering as proof of religious devotion and social status. Perhaps most disturbing was how completely this system had normalized extreme practices within Aztec society. Children grew up watching ritualized abuse as normal religious observance, learning that human suffering was not just acceptable, but necessary for cosmic stability. Spanish missionaries reported that Aztec converts to Christianity struggled to understand why their new religion didn't require similar demonstrations of devotion through sacrifice. The medical knowledge that supported these practices was sophisticated and horrifying. Aztec physicians understood human anatomy well enough to maximize suffering while prolonging consciousness, developing techniques that would keep victims aware through procedures that should have caused immediate unconsciousness. This wasn't primitive brutality, but systematic application of medical knowledge to enhance religious experience through human suffering. Modern attempts to understand Aztec culture often focus on their architectural and agricultural achievements while minimizing the systematic intimate violence that funded and justified their expansion. This historical denial dishonors the memory of countless victims whose suffering built the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization and prevents us from understanding how quickly advanced societies can normalize extreme cruelty when it serves religious and political purposes. Before we dive into Itzel's descent into horror, subscribe and hit that like button if you can handle what's coming next. And definitely comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I think it's incredible that people across the world are connected by the same curiosity about the darkest parts of human history. Itzel's year as the earthly representative of Xilonen began with ceremonies that seemed like honors, but were actually the first stages of systematic conditioning designed to prepare her for ritual destruction. The priests who selected her weren't choosing a bride, but identifying raw material for religious theater that would culminate in her death, while thousands of worshippers celebrated her suffering as divine entertainment. The selection process itself was deeply invasive and deliberately humiliating. Young women from across the empire were brought to Tenochtitlan and subjected to examinations that assessed not just their physical appearance, but their psychological suitability for prolonged conditioning. The priests looked for specific traits, beauty that would make their eventual destruction more dramatic, intelligence that would allow them to understand their fate, and emotional sensitivity that would produce the kind of suffering the gods supposedly desired. Itzel was chosen specifically because her reactions during the examination suggested she would break in interesting ways. The priests tested her pain tolerance, her fear responses, and her capacity for emotional attachment. They weren't looking for the strongest candidates, but for those whose destruction would be most psychologically satisfying for audiences who had learned to see human suffering as religious entertainment. The initial preparation involved luxury that was actually a form of psychological manipulation. Itzel was moved into quarters within the temple complex, where she lived in comfort that exceeded anything experienced by Aztec nobility. She was fed foods that were illegal for common people to consume, dressed in clothing that cost more than most families earned in years, and attended by servants who treated her with reverence that seemed genuine but was actually calculated theater. But this luxury came with conditions that gradually revealed its true purpose. Itzel was required to participate in daily rituals that became progressively more invasive and degrading. What began as simple prayers evolved into ceremonies that violated her physical autonomy while being framed as divine communion. The priests explained that her body no longer belonged to her but to the goddess she represented, making resistance not just futile but cosmically offensive. The conditioning process was systematic and sophisticated. Itzel was isolated from family and friends, making the temple personnel her only human contact. She was taught that her previous identity was an illusion and that her true self was the goddess whose earthly vessel she had become. This identity replacement happened gradually, through daily repetition of new behaviors and constant reinforcement of her divine status. Spanish chronicler Bernardino de Sahagún documented similar preparation processes based on interviews with Aztec survivors. His accounts describe how selected women underwent what modern psychology would recognize as systematic brainwashing designed to make them willing participants in their own eventual sacrifice. The priests understood that voluntary cooperation produced better religious theater than forced compliance. The most disturbing aspect of Itzel's preparation was how it combined genuine affection with systematic abuse. The temple personnel formed emotional bonds with her while simultaneously preparing her for destruction. They celebrated her beauty while planning its obliteration, praised her intelligence while working to destroy her capacity for independent thought. As Itzel's year of preparation progressed, the rituals became more explicitly designed to break down her psychological resistance to what Spanish sources euphemistically called divine marriage. These ceremonies, documented in Aztec codices that survived Spanish book burning, reveal a sophisticated understanding of how to manipulate human psychology through combinations of pleasure and pain, honor and degradation. The preparation for divine marriage involved teaching Itzel specific behaviors and responses that would be required during the final ceremony. The priests framed this instruction as sacred education, explaining that the goddess required her earthly representative to demonstrate specific forms of submission and vulnerability. What they were actually doing was training her to participate in her own ritualized destruction while believing she was fulfilling cosmic duty. The training sessions took place in chambers beneath the main temple that archaeologists have only recently begun to excavate. These rooms were designed to replicate the supernatural realm where the marriage would supposedly take place, with elaborate decorations that combined religious imagery with equipment designed for restraint and control. Itzel learned to see these preparations as holy rather than horrifying, because she had been systematically conditioned to interpret suffering as divine favor. Contemporary Aztec sources describe how women like Itzel were taught to desire their own destruction through careful manipulation of their emotional and physical responses. The priests used techniques that modern researchers recognize as sophisticated forms of psychological conditioning, creating associations between pain and pleasure, degradation and honor, that would make the final sacrifice feel like fulfillment rather than murder. The sacred marriage preparations also involved other temple personnel who had undergone similar conditioning in previous years. These women, who had survived their own training through various circumstances, helped prepare new candidates by sharing their experiences and reinforcing the religious interpretation of systematic abuse. They genuinely believed they were helping Itzel achieve divine union, making their participation even more psychologically damaging. The physical preparations were equally systematic and disturbing. Itzel underwent procedures that were described as purification, but were actually designed to mark her body in ways that would enhance the visual impact of her eventual sacrifice. The priests applied substances that would make her skin more sensitive to pain, modified her appearance in ways that would create specific aesthetic effects during the final ceremony, and taught her physical positions that would display her suffering to maximum advantage for the watching crowds. Spanish missionary Diego Duran documented the psychological effects of this preparation process based on observations of surviving participants. He noted that women who underwent sacred marriage training displayed symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as complex trauma responses, dissociation, emotional numbing, and complete dependency on their abusers for emotional validation and survival guidance. The final months of preparation involved rehearsals of the actual sacrifice ceremony, with Itzel practicing her role in what she believed would be a spiritual transformation but was actually choreographed murder. These rehearsals served multiple purposes. They ensured the ceremony would proceed smoothly. They reinforced Itzel's conditioning to accept her fate, and they provided preliminary entertainment for temple personnel, who enjoyed watching the psychological preparation almost as much as they anticipated the final performance. The culmination of Itzel's year of preparation coincided with the annual festival of Xochipilli, the god of fertility and excess, when normal Aztec social rules were temporarily suspended in favor of religiously sanctioned chaos that made her individual suffering part of a citywide celebration of systematic human degradation. Spanish chroniclers described these festivals as orgies of violence and depravity that exceeded anything they had witnessed in European religious observances. The festival began with the distribution of octli, a fermented beverage that was illegal for consumption except during religious ceremonies, and various hallucinogenic substances that altered participants' perceptions and lowered their inhibitions. The priests explained that these substances allowed ordinary humans to participate in divine consciousness, but their actual purpose was to remove psychological barriers that normally prevented systematic abuse of fellow community members. As the intoxicants took effect, the normal hierarchy of Aztec society dissolved into temporary chaos where servants could abuse masters, children could dominate adults, and previously forbidden behaviors became not just acceptable, but religiously mandated. Spanish observer Fray Diego de Landa wrote that these festivals transformed civilized communities into scenes that resembled his conception of hell more than any earthly celebration. The chaos wasn't random, but carefully orchestrated by priests who used the temporary suspension of social rules to conduct rituals that would be impossible under normal circumstances. Participants were encouraged to act on impulses that Aztec law normally punished by death, creating an atmosphere where extreme violence and degradation felt like religious liberation rather than criminal behavior. Itzal's role in this festival was as both participant and victim, required to engage in activities that violated every principle of normal Aztec morality, while simultaneously being prepared for her final sacrifice. The priests explained that her participation in the chaos was necessary preparation for divine marriage, teaching her to embrace behaviors that would have horrified her before her year of conditioning. The festival served multiple social functions beyond simple religious observance. It provided a release valve for social tensions that might otherwise threaten Aztec political stability, allowed communities to participate in systematic violence without individual moral responsibility, and created shared experiences of transgression that bound participants together through collective guilt and mutual complicity. Archaeological evidence from festival sites shows specialized equipment designed for restraint and display, suggesting that much of the chaos was actually carefully choreographed performance rather than spontaneous explosion of repressed desires. The Aztecs had learned to systematize even their moments of supposed liberation, turning community-wide participation in abuse into another form of social control. The psychological impact on participants was devastating and intentional. Spanish missionaries working with Aztec converts reported that many struggled with guilt and trauma related to their participation in these festivals, describing symptoms that modern psychology would recognize as indicators of systematic abuse. The festivals didn't just celebrate violence, but created communities of perpetrators who were complicit in each other's moral destruction. As the festival reached its climax, Itzal faced the final ceremony that would transform her from honored goddess representative into sacrificial victim, completing a year-long process of conditioning that had prepared her to desire her own destruction, while thousands of her fellow citizens celebrated her suffering as entertainment and religious duty. The systematic concealment of Aztec sexual practices began with Spanish colonial authorities, who recognized that detailed accounts of indigenous religious behavior could undermine their justifications for conquest and conversion. While Spanish chroniclers documented these practices extensively in private reports to church and crown authorities, public accounts were sanitized to focus on more palatable aspects of Aztec culture, like architecture and agriculture. Archaeological evidence discovered since the 1970s has forced scholars to confront uncomfortable truths about the extent and sophistication of Aztec sexual violence. Excavations at sites like the Templo Mayor have uncovered specialized chambers and equipment that can only be explained as facilities for systematic ritualized abuse. Carbon dating and bone analysis confirm that these facilities operated for centuries, processing thousands of victims through methods refined over generations. The preservation of Aztec codices, despite Spanish efforts to destroy indigenous books, provides detailed documentation of practices that colonial authorities tried to suppress. These pictographic manuscripts include explicit depictions of ceremonies that Spanish missionaries found too disturbing to translate fully, leaving modern scholars to decode visual evidence of systematic, intimate violence disguised as religious observance. Understanding Aztec sexual practices isn't just historical curiosity, but warning about how quickly sophisticated civilizations can normalize extreme cruelty when it serves religious or political interests. The elaborate theological and legal frameworks that supported violence demonstrate how institutions can be corrupted to facilitate rather than prevent systematic human abuse. The deliberate historical concealment of these practices represents ongoing complicity in crimes that shaped Mesoamerican development for centuries. By sanitizing Aztec history into tales of noble indigenous civilization destroyed by European colonialism, modern scholarship avoids confronting uncomfortable truths about the capacity for systematic violence that exists within all human societies, regardless of their technological or cultural achievements. Itzel died, believing she had achieved divine union, her year of systematic conditioning so complete that she experienced her ritual murder as spiritual fulfillment rather than criminal violence. She represents thousands of real individuals whose suffering built the foundation of Aztec religious authority. Victims whose names we'll never know, but whose stories deserve more than historical footnotes. If this glimpse into history's hidden darkness has left you wanting more, click on the video appearing on your screen now to discover another shocking chapter that history tried to erase. And if you found this exploration as compelling as I did, hit that subscribe button so we can keep peeling back the layers together. These forgotten voices deserve to be heard, and there are so many more stories waiting to be told.